Welcome back to Murder with Friends. Today we're talking about Andrei Chikatilo, and in this final part where we are picking up, he has been arrested for suspicious behavior at a train station. They were able to tie him to a theft, so they were able to get him behind bars for 3 months, but Daron, they couldn't tie him to the murder because of a rare blood type. Can you explain a little bit about why they couldn't tie this guy to any of the killings?
Yeah, so at all the killings, obviously there was semen there, and most people, you can get their blood type from any sort of bodily secretion. But with him, he actually had a rare genetic condition in which you can only tell his blood type from an actual blood sample. So you wouldn't be able to match him to it just based on the semen sample.
So what about if he had left a really clear blood sample at one of the crime scenes? You know, maybe if his hand had gotten open, if he had slipped on a knife or something like that. Would that have been enough, or would you need like really a blood sample from the arm, like an IV sort of sample?
So any blood from him, and they would have been able to catch him, but because it was only semen, and the technology back then also wasn't good enough to get. If you were a non-secretor like him, it wasn't good enough to actually get the blood type from the semen. These days, obviously the technology is better, and you can get somebody's blood type even if they are a non-secretor.
So they Russian authorities earnestly thought that they had just gotten the wrong guy, that he was being suspicious.
Yeah, they're like,
that's
there's
not
no
a crime.
way, he doesn't match the blood type, so it can't be him.
Despite being found at the train station where it had already been established that the killer was using public transportation for his kills. He's found there soliciting a minor in a very suspicious and odd way with a knife and a rope.
Yeah.
And that's still, that's not
enough,
a crime.
I guess. Not enough.
So he is behind bars for 3 months, and then when he is released, he promptly kills 2 more women. At this point, more than 20 people had been killed. Just people were really, really actively losing their lives, and the Russian authorities were absolutely at a loss, especially when you have this guy that seems like he could be a match, and then because of just sort of, would you say that this was that they were inept in the part of the science, or was it just sort of a consequence of the time that the blood type they weren't able to match it? Like, is it their fault? Is there anyone at fault here, I guess is what I'm asking.
I mean, I'm unsure if they were aware of that rare genetic condition. I mean, only like 15 to 20% of people have that. However, every other piece sort of added up. And sometimes blood evidence or fluid evidence isn't, I mean, obviously in this case, it didn't really help them at all. But I mean, all the other pieces matched up. So yeah, I feel like they're at fault.
So I think it's definitely a little bit of both, because if they should be aware of blood conditions and blood types when clearing a suspect that is otherwise such a perfect fit.
Yeah.
What they do that does help the case is they enlist the help of psychiatrist Alexander Bukanovsky. And I'm sorry if I'm butchering that name. And he puts together a forensic profile or a forensic psychological profile of what we can expect from the killer. And that really matches Andrei Chikatilo to a T.
Yeah, describes him perfectly.
Right. He talks about he would be antisocial, but he could be married. But if he was married, he wouldn't have a sexual relationship. That he likely was sexually deviant in his early life. All of this just so perfectly lines up. But what's frustrating is that so much of Chikatilo's earlier sexual deviance isn't on record at that point, because the school systems weren't communicating with each other. So that's frustrating. And this really freaks out Chikatilo. He's aware of what the police work is going on around him. At this point, Soviet Russia knows that there is a killer on the loose. And so he's avoiding public transportation. He has a little bit of a dry spell, and he only begins killing again in 1988. And this is sort of his final, for lack of a better word, hurrah at killing. He couldn't contain himself anymore. And during this time, 1988, 19 people die in a year, Daron.
Yeah, 19 in a year.
He's gotten so good at killing at this point.
Yeah, he's really got it down to, I mean, again, for lack of a better term, to a science. I mean, for him, he knows exactly what he wants to do, how to do it, where to leave the body, and he doesn't think he's going to get caught.
Right, and he doesn't think he's going to get caught, and even though he's no longer using public transportation as much, he's using random victimology that does work in his favor with regards to getting away with these crimes. So he's switched his victimology. Most of the people that died during 1988, during this year, are young boys. And again, that comes back to he's killing for pleasure.
Right.
Not for, which gives him sexual gratification, but it no longer aligns with his sexual orientation, which is such an interesting thing about who this guy becomes.
Yeah.
He begins his life early on as this sexual deviant who was so humiliated by his rejection by women, and so women are the victims that he preys on early on. And then when he becomes a killer and he really embodies this evil, then it's just he wants to kill his easiest targets, and those are young boys that he would, lead off with candy or with toys or whatever sort of treats that he was able to lure them with. And then finally, November 6th, 1990, Andrei Chikatilo was spotted acting suspicious because he is covered in blood walking out of the woods. He isn't arrested, though, until November 20th, 1990, because they had to put surveillance on him and make sure he's definitely the guy. He's definitely the guy. And what I thought was sort of interesting about how he was first spotted acting suspicious is they see him walking from the woods, and the investigator or the person that spotted him reported to investigators, I thought it was weird that he was walking from the woods because the only people that go into the woods is to forage mushrooms in that area, and he wasn't dressed to forage mushrooms, and therefore it's weird. And then they got closer and they're like, yeah, no, he's not dressed to forage mushrooms, definitely dressed to kill people though. Like super looks like a murderer. So November 20th, 1990, he's apprehended, which is 9 years after his murder spree had begun.
That's so crazy to me because there were so many signs and just like so many things piling up on him that would lead investigators straight to him, but it took him walking out of the woods covered in blood to kind of seal the deal.
Yeah, he slipped through the cracks and had so many lucky breaks with his blood type. That's so frustrating when you read this story as it unfolds, when you read through the case. I kept thinking when I first learned about him, oh, now they're going to get him, now they're going to get him. And I was so confused when I heard about when his execution was. That's so strange, it's so late. They must have caught him within the first 4 years. No. Just such a mishandling of affairs that went down here. I think absolutely it does come down to a mishandling across departments.
Definitely.
But he's apprehended, he's put on trial, and his trial becomes really eerie and reminiscent of sort of a circus. A silver lining to this case, at least for the peace and the closure of the victims and families, is that he does open up. I don't know if that would give me closure, and that's something I've talked about a little bit before on this show. I don't know if I'd want to know, but he does talk. And he talks to the guy that did his profile that helped police to apprehend him. Alexander Bukanovsky becomes sort of his confidant. And he claims that Andrei Chikatilo claims he's killed 56 people, but we can only verify 53. I don't know that it necessarily matters. He's still a monster either way. It's not like the extra 3 gets him a record or something.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to me that he basically opened the floodgates when the psychiatrist, was talking to him and just told him everything about every single person that he killed. It's almost as if he was like kind of waiting to tell somebody about his like murderous feats, as if he was proud of it or something. Yeah,
and also what's interesting is that he was a little bit coy with authorities at first, and he did maintain his innocence for a time, but something about Alexander Bukanovsky, who did put this profile together and who understood him so completely even before he met him, and you see this odd relationship develop where Andrei does want to talk to Alexander about what he has done, and he reenacts the murders on mannequins, which is very creepy. He takes them to murder sites that they had yet to have discovered. And to me, it's the way that he was able to keep track of all these murder sites is really unsettling, because again, I think we talked about this in part 1. This was a smart guy. This was not a stupid guy. And we talked about Ed Gein on this show before, and that was a dumb killer. He was, maybe an infamous killer, but he was stupid. But Andrei Chikatilo, what's so stomach turning about him is that he was really smart, and he was able to get away with way more murders than the authorities initially even thought.
Yeah, I think at the time when he was talking to the psychiatrist, the police didn't even know how many there were. I think around that time they thought like 36 or like mid-30s, and then he confessed to even more than that and showed them where the bodies were.
Right.
So I think it even surprised them.
And it would get more and more surprising because his trial is so bizarre and captures the attention of Russia and the world over. So let's go to a clip right now of exactly what we're talking about with this circus of a trial.
On the morning of April 14th, 1992, in the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don, citizens flooded the steps of the House of Justice, anxious for a glimpse of the accused killer, Andrei Chikatilo. For months, newspaper headlines had branded him the Red Ripper, or the Butcher of Rostov. Chikatilo was dressed in a souvenir Olympic sports shirt provided by the court. His head had been shaved, a standard procedure to guard against lice. As proceedings began, the setting resembled a circus more than a murder trial.
He was in a large iron cage in the courtroom. The cage was to protect him from the rage of the parents of the victims.
He was never able to sit at a table and converse with his lawyer the way a Western defendant would have been.
So yeah, it was a really bizarre scene, and he went on to give about a 2-hour testimony at his trial that was just all over the place, and he blamed a lot of people for who he had become, although he did accept responsibility for what he was accused of. Can you talk a little bit about what he said was to blame for who he was and why he became a murderer?
Yeah, I mean, he blamed Russia, he blamed Stalin, he blamed the government. He said that famine and just how he grew up in such poverty and with no food, he literally blamed the government for his problems.
And I think that's why it captured the nation's attention in such a profound way, was because they knew what the struggle had been under Stalin, and they knew what so many of them had gone through and struggled through. And yet they'd gone through the other side without becoming a serial killer.
Right.
And so to see someone manifest this deep hurt and mistreatment and government just absolutely destroying its own people, waging war almost against its own people, and that he was like, I am the embodiment of that. That evil created me, was, I think, really strange for people to look at, because so many other Soviet Russians were saying, okay, but I'm not a serial killer. And, you know, I see a lot of your logic. I agree with you. It was bad. We hated it. Stalin fucking sucked, man. But you don't become a serial killer.
Exactly.
But his excuse, or at least his testimony, did resonate with people. It's really strange to watch. He also whipped his dick out.
Casual, you know.
Just casual, because on top of saying that I was a creation of, you know, these government practices and malpractices against its own people, also impotence and his rejection by his mother, and then by women as well, all sort of played into his storytelling of who he had become. So there's that, and it was just such a strange and gross trial.
It was strange, and I think he was trying to play up that he was crazy so that he wouldn't get the death penalty. So I think he really wanted to, I mean, not necessarily embellish, but just make things sound.
I think you can use the word embellish. I think that he definitely exaggerated a great deal of what he told the Russian people. I think an example of that is what we talked about in part 1, that whether or not he had a brother, and if he did his mom really tell him that his brother was murdered and cannibalized as like a bedtime story? The only record that we have of that being true is his own testimony.
Right.
So it's makes you wonder, is that just a dramatic embellishment, a lie to gain sympathy from the Russian people so that you would avoid the death penalty?
Yeah, I mean, he definitely was trying anything he could to avoid the death penalty. I mean, when he took down his pants, I mean, who wouldn't think somebody like that is, a little bit challenged, or, has some sort of mental problem?
Right. And then to blame it on the government as well really garners that sympathy too. what I do think is interesting is that I don't really know exactly how Russian prisons were in the 1990s and the early 1990s. I would imagine not great.
Not
so
the best, probably.
It's interesting that he was trying not to get the death penalty because he was so vilified and hated by the Russian people following, when all these accusations came out and when there was a mountain of evidence against him. I'm surprised that he would have probably been killed even worse behind bars. I mean,
yeah, definitely.
He was, enemy number one in Russia when this was all going down. But he does get the death penalty. All of his antics do not work in the courtroom, and he is shot in the back of the head on Valentine's Day in 1994.
So we were alive and well then.
We were 4 years old.
Yeah, it's so crazy to think about.
That's
that
so
this
crazy.
Prolific serial killer was, kind of there during our lifetime. There's not many serial killers that I can think of that were like very prominent in our lifetime. I mean, they don't come along very often.
Yeah, well, thank God for that,
Thank
Daron.
God for that.
So that's the story of Andrei Chikatilo, and he is probably one of the most prolific serial killers that we've covered on this show. What are the themes, when you think about Andrei Chikatilo, how would you sum up how you remember him, how you learned about him, what your research has taught you about him?
I think a lot about his story has to do with where he was growing up at the time. And I think that had a huge impact on his childhood and how he grew up. And not only that, with the government, with the state-run media, that had a huge impact on him not getting caught. So I think the overarching theme is how the government there really sort of extended the period where he was able to kill.
They certainly were not helpful in a timely resolution to solving this murder cases, multiple cases. I think that for me, what it comes down to is that, we're talking about 53, potentially 56 people who lost their lives at the hands of Andrei Chikatilo. And it's frustrating when we talk about cases on this show that I feel like we're not going to be able to tell everyone's story.
Right.
And I really would urge you guys to do your own independent research as well as watch our show.
Yeah.
And what can you guys learn from this? And because we can only scratch the surface. We only have like an hour of your time. And there's so many other stories in here, especially with the state-run media, that I think is so interesting to dive into, and how he was able to abduct these transients at the time, and why were there so many transients at train stations that were moving around? Where were the opportunities in Soviet Russia? There's just so much to dive into. So I really urge you guys to keep the conversation going in the comments section below. And if you want any exclusive content from Murder with Friends, we have a whole bunch of episodes that we actually haven't put out there yet on YouTube. Head over to tytnetwork.com/join. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support, and I'll see you next time on Murder with Friends.